This is a component of a book that I'm writing on human and non-human vocality, atmospheric pollution, and climate change, more or less. I don't really have time to lay out the rationale for a book on voice and climate change. It doesn't seem to be, on the face of it, the most intuitive kind of connection. What does the voice have to do with climate change? And so that's sort of the writerly task that I've assigned myself in writing this book, is to kind of figure out what that might be. My thought initially in starting the project was that all the work in voice studies that I've ever written or read kind of presumes that voice is in the foreground. And if air is mentioned at all, it's just deep in the background, right? Air is just the medium necessary in order for my voice to kind of reach your ear, right? It's transparent in every sense of that word. It's theoretically uninteresting. It's just, kind of there. That's in voice studies and in music studies. But everywhere else, air is front page news, right? Climate change is an atmospheric problem. Atmospheric pollution is, depending on how you count these numbers, the number 2 or 3 global killer. So kind of, as soon as you step out of the hothouse of music and voice and sound studies, air leaps to the foreground. So my thought experiment for myself was to see what would happen if I thought about voice and kind of flipped the foreground-background relations on them, placing air in the foreground. Then what would happen to voice? Now, one of the things that I've kind of come up with in service of this project is a working definition that I'm calling atmospheric voice. So in this project that I'll be reading a piece of today, voice, when I say voice, you need to kind of forget what you think that word means. When I say voice, I mean not the kind of emotionally expressive sound that comes from the exceptional creature of the human. I mean nothing more or less than gaseous exchange between two environments, a small one and a large one, with a little bit of turbulence and with lasting consequences for both sides. So in the human frame, gas is exchanged between the tiny environment of my lungs and this room, right? Or extrapolating out, since there's no leak-proof room, the atmosphere more broadly. The turbulence manifests as vibration. So the sound of my voice is that little bit of turbulence that is going on when air passes from my small environment into a larger one. And the lasting consequences come from the fact that we live in this era that is commonly but controversially called the Anthropocene, the era where human activity is the kind of major geological factor. And one of the things that air in the Anthropocene has in it, it's charged with particles of that were once locked safely in the deep earth, right? So members of our species have brought those particles out of the deep earth, combusted them, and spread them all over the planet. We've also invented new particles. We've created new particles. And there's now, even in St. John's, even in this pristine, environment that you enjoy here, there's no kind of square kilometer that doesn't have traces of our nuclear activities and certainly of our kind of industrial activities. So air already is kind of a collaborative project. It's not this pure substance. It's not an abstraction. It's something that we helped make. So I breathe in, if we're talking about human voices, in preparation to give voice, I breathe in air that has these microparticles in it. They stick in the sticky labyrinths of my lungs, and they begin slowly killing me. I breathe out, I give voice. I'm doing it right now. Microbes from my insides are sent out into the environment, and they give you pneumonia, right? So I want, part of the project is designed to draw our attention away from the eventy qualities of voice, all of those things that we think of when we think of voice, and towards these kind of distributional, not fully controllable by human, longer temporalities that are always there, but that we don't tend to think about. My hope is that this will bring music studies, voice studies, and sound studies a little more deeply into the conversation on environment. My other hope is that this will be therapeutic for me because I'm super freaked out about climate change, and so my general MO is to take the thing that I'm most freaked out about and turn it into a scholarly project, since I can't afford therapy, and it seems to be working for me. There are two types of talks, I think. Just like there are two types of people. There are the people who say that there are two types of people, and then all the other people. There are two types of talks. There are talks that are organized around explication, and there are talks that are organized around evocation. And I think most academic talks, like your expectation, might be explication and not evocation, right? I'm an academic. I'm supposed to be up here giving you smart thoughts, and you have paper, and you're writing down this. Right? You need to put your paper down now, because this is not going to be a performance of explication, but of evocation. I'm going to try to kind of evoke the poetics of our entanglement through voice with one another, with radical others, and with environment itself. So that's my goal. I have two microphones here. This is my ethnographic microphone. This is my theoretical microphone. So I'm going to be moving back and forth. I hope you brought your Dramamine. I'm going to be listing like on a ship back and forth. And there will be a few kind of no actual slides, but some visual distractions. So my goal, I think my visual distractions are really beautiful, and my goal is to have my words be powerful enough that that my visual array doesn't kind of pull you in. But if you don't like my words or are not kind of into them, feel free to just kind of bliss out and watch my videos. All right, here we go. The creature. The creature was not like us. The creature was so much not like us that it first presented itself to us as not a creature at all, but an object, a thing. My two teenage sons happened upon the creature in the summer of 2019 in upstate New York. It was a sweltering day, the kind that might have set a heat record a few years ago, but has now become commonplace. As they rounded a bend on a country road flanked by a tree-filled wetland on one side and an overgrown hayfield on the other, they came upon a large, irregular mound the diameter of a manhole cover. The sound of their excited shouts, "Dad! Dad! Come look at this thing!" reached me on the porch of our small cabin down the road before speeding away across a nearby pond, bouncing off the hills in the distance and returning a half-second later as echo. I hollered back, "Coming!" and my voice echoed as well. Much has been written about echo. It is perhaps the most frequently metaphorized sound, standing in for history, echoes of the past, glory, their victory would echo in the hills forevermore, and uncanny mystery, among other qualities. At first glance, echo would seem to be an apt metaphor for describing the relation between voice and environment that I'll be exploring in this paper. If you have ever stood on a mountain trail separated from the next range by a small valley and found yourself compelled to yell out, "Oh-ho!" or "Echo!" or "Yop!" you will understand what I mean. The call and response nature of echo appears literally to answer the question, what is the relation between voice and environment? A question that is really nothing other than a sound-centered way of asking, what is the relation between self and world? Echo answers this question, and its answers are all comforting. I call out into the void, and echo responds, "You are never alone." My voice and the body that produces it are small, but echo says, "You are as big as me." A mundane human voice issues from my mouth, and echo molds it into something extraordinary and omnidirectional, as if the trees themselves are talking. Echo says, "You will be remembered." Echo says, "The world is an instrument for you to play." Echo conquers and cathects space, distends time, and magnifies voice to heroic Jolly Green Giant proportions. And therein lies the problem, as the image of the human as master of his environment is precisely what has led to the tragic destabilization of life on Earth as we know it. Entranced by my voice echoing across the pond, I feel I am the actor and nature the stage, I the ventriloquist and nature the dummy. I hear voice as a clean aural spectacle that takes place in a human time frame and leaves no residue, no fumes. Echo is a metaphor for human dominance of the environment without negative consequences. As such, echo, along with the entire world of music that is its elaboration, lies. I came trotting up to the boys in the thing. Blackish, brownish, greenish, plopped right down in the middle of the road, it appeared to be a desiccated log with a clump of wetland soil attached to its underside. Moss covered much of its concave bark-like surface, as did a patchy carpet of tiny leafy and ciliated plants. But a tapered extension jutting out from beneath the bark on one side looked uncannily like a tail. And when I stepped around the other side and saw a line of thick, sharp claws half hidden in the dark folds at its base, my initial frame of reference crumbled. After a few seconds of conceptual freefall, a new frame snapped into focus with the abruptness of a parachute deployed. The bark, I now saw, was a shell, the clump of undergrowth a scaly body, the apple-sized bulge on the claw side a semi-retracted head. The moss and plants, however, were indeed moss and plants, a mobile ecosystem thriving on the wizened surface of a large turtle that was, I would later learn, a male, like me, and old. In fact, almost certainly older than me. The thing was a creature with a life's worth of growth and hunting and sexual liaisons and icy winters and hot summers behind it, a life of crawling around at and just beneath the muddy bottom fringe of the Earth's atmosphere, a life that had brought it to this moment, this chance encounter with a trio of tall bipedal mammals on a bend in a country road. But had it lived to see this encounter or not? Was the creature alive or dead? I saw no signs of life. It was absolutely immobile and unresponsive to the three of us crowding around it. It occurred to me that it must have expired in the heat beating down from above and radiating up from the asphalt below as it attempted to drag itself laboriously across the road for some unknown purpose. Closer inspection revealed, however, that two small, smooth areas on the head were a glinting pair of thoroughly camouflaged eyes, and that those eyes were wide open and regarding me. How to describe such a moment of regard or beholding? What truths can be grasped? What connections made across the chasm of species, genus, family, order, class? These questions pluck at the threads of a discursive spiderweb that vastly predates my encounter with the turtle. One could say that the struggle to know the other has been the defining quest of modernity. In the words of John Durham Peters, quote, "To meet abysses of communication at every hand is part of what it means to be modern." For more than a century, the anthropological project has been structured around the hope that sustained co-presence and face-to-face encounters can inch ethnographers closer to the life worlds of their subjects. For roughly the same period of time, generations of psychoanalysts have sought out methods to explore the subconscious, that stranger who lies within oneself. Participant observation and the talking cure tend to sputter out, however, when the other in question is a non-human. At the same time, the interspecies gaze has long been a source of fascination for people who care about animals, a diverse population whose ranks include farmers, pet owners, veterinarians, artists, and philosophers even. Jacques Derrida, in The Animal That Therefore I Am, describes a moment when he was walking around naked in his house, when he looked over and saw his cat looking at him. Under the gaze of his cat, he felt a strange sense of shame, which prompted him to write an extended essay, being Derrida. The theologian Martin Buber wrote of his cat that, quote, "An animal's eyes have the power to speak a great language." I want to believe this is true. All the same, I can't help but wonder, if I can only have imperfect knowledge of myself, let alone of you, how can I possibly comprehend the inner life of a non-human creature? Recall the philosopher Ludwig Wittgenstein's famous aphorism about the incommensurability of worlds. He said, "If a lion could speak, we would not understand him." What, other than an anthropomorphic caricature or narcissistic reflection of myself, can possibly be communicated in an interspecies gaze or voice or touch? Returning to the turtle in the road, I knelt to get a better look at it. Its unblinking eyes followed me as I got down to its level, separated from its face by no more than a few inches. I stared at it. It appeared to return my stare, although its eyes looked myopic, unfocused, like those of someone who is blind or who is trying to look like they're not looking at you. Despite my best efforts, the interspecies gaze was unrewarding and opaque. Aside from its eyes, the only movement I could detect was that of a small, worm-like creature that was improbably perched on the side of the turtle's face. No longer than my fingernail, it waved back and forth. It scrunched up and extended, curled back upon itself, stretched out its body as if reaching toward me. The little guy appeared to be, for lack of a better word, flirting with me, beckoning me closer as if it were a come-hither finger or a feather fan. The turtle's eyes watched me watching the little worm, which I soon realized, with a rush of wonder and revulsion and fear and respect, was not an autonomous creature at all, but part of the turtle. This bizarre external uvula was the product of an evolutionary scheme that helped the camouflaged turtle draw in its wetland prey. It was a lure, not too different from an actual worm on a fisherman's hook. It was, in this sense, a technology designed to frustrate the mutual act of regard and recognition in which the turtle and I had been, however imperfectly engaged, replacing it with a unidirectional line of surveillance. The turtle looked at me with impunity as I fixated on the dancing presence of the eyeless, selfless faux creature on its face. Unlike the fish and other animals that the turtle hunted, I recognized the turtle as a turtle before being distracted by this tiny, throbbing pseudo-tongue. Nonetheless, its seductive movement drew me in and drew me away from the turtle's gaze as effectively as pickpockets direct the attention of their marks away from their wristwatches. With its resemblance to a uvula or a small glistening tongue, the turtle's wiggling lure leads us, however improbably, to the theme of voice. Note that the turtle has yet to open its mouth in this story. That will come later. More precisely, the fake worm invites us to consider voice as a vector of seduction and surveillance, the core activities that its dancing presence made possible. Seduction and surveillance form a potent dyad familiar to us from spy novels and James Bond movies. But we don't need to conjure the cinematic specter of sex, guns, martinis, and espionage in order to see how crucial they are to the vocal exchange. For while communication may be the preferred term of art for what human voices do, it is clear that voices always exceed the content of the lexical messages they carry. Beneath the communicative channel, voices engage in a range of covert operations. Let me count the ways. Two human voices in conversation are not wholly unlike an intertwining of tongues, each shaping itself around the other, each probing and caressing the other, seeking to please and to know in equal measure. Like tongues engaged in a deep kiss, conversing voices seduce and surveil. They caress and assess, all at the same time, or oscillating quickly between these two activities. Now, this is not precisely the aspect of consciousness that the phenomenologist Maurice Merleau-Ponty had in mind in his famous story about your right hand touching your left being the sensed and the instrument of sensing. But there is a kind of double sensation or double role to vocality that is similar here. When we talk, romantically or platonically, it makes no difference. I microtonally adapt my vocal patterns to yours and you to mine. With that mutual adaptation, we are both exploring, feeling out one another independent of the words we share. I am surveilling the micro-shadings of your tone and their possible implications at the same moment that I elicit and mimetically reproduce them. You speak at a pace and in tones that fit pleasingly with mine, and you register the signs of pleasure in my voice. We find our rhythm. A congenial flow is achieved. Affect is transmitted alongside information. The conversation takes off. Our breathing becomes synchronized. We laugh together as a sign that this Mobius-like process of looped elicitations and evaluations is working. The musical equivalence of this, the metaphorical conversations that take place among improvisers on a bandstand or among a cappella choristers constantly tuning each pitch to the consensus, these equivalents distill and dramatize this process. However, the mutually enriching conversation that I've been describing can only occur when certain conditions are present: common codes and aesthetic frames, commensurate purposes and sensibilities, epistemologies of intelligibility, lack of imminent danger. This kind of effulgent, intimate vocal encounter is a boutique phenomenon, a small blip within the vast totality of earthly vocal acts. What of the billowing cloud of unheard and unheeded voices that surrounds it? What of the failed meeting of the minds, the awkward exchanges, the mutterings in the night? What of the plea that falls on deaf ears? What of coughs and stutters and echolalic babblings? And more to the point here, what of the panicked bleating of sheep in the abattoir? And what of the massive, passionless acts of gaseous exchange between our rotting garbage and the upper troposphere? What of the insistent exhalations of the planet's 1 billion automobiles? What of oceanic respiration? Voice as a phenomenon can involve the transmission of knowledge and feeling, but it also operates on a fluid atmospheric register that is free of lexical meaning. Just as the undulating worm distracts us from the turtle's true purpose, so does the affective richness of the intimate vocal encounter obscure the voice's many particulate and atmospheric entanglements. In this sense, the human-centered emotional understanding of vocality plays a central role in what Amitav Ghosh calls the great derangement, the broad failure over centuries of art and literature to grasp the true relation between human culture and environment. Ghosh argues that we were lulled by our own stories into a sense of environmental complacency. I want to add that it was our enchanting voices that told us those stories and sang the fateful lullabies. My son Ben, ever the pragmatist, pulled me away from the mesmerizing sight of the worm that was not a worm by saying, "Dad, we need to get him out of the road before somebody comes around that corner and runs him over." He was right. The bend in the road is a blind curve, and the local pickup trucks tend to rattle around it at speed. His younger brother Joey, who had just jokingly proposed that we adopt the animal, agreed. My hound dog, Ruby, who thankfully was elsewhere as she would have burst an artery barking at this alien, weighs 35 pounds. With this as a point of reference, I put the turtle at about 50, heavy but doable. Reminding myself to keep my back straight, I circled around to its tail end, grasped the turtle by the rim of the shell, and attempted a lift. The important thing about what happens next was the speed with which it took place. At the first sign of my upward pull, the turtle's head exploded forward and swung around toward my left hand on a shockingly extended neck. Its pointed beak opened wide and chopped shut an inch from my left index finger. 4 beclawed legs shot out in 4 directions and made an aggressive raking motion in the air. I broke contact and leapt back as an involuntary and extended "ho!" escaped my lips. The turtle let out a sustained hiss from that long-necked mouth, and then fell silent, pulling its head back in toward its body and resuming its stump-like stillness. My heart racing, my sons laughing in disbelief and delight, a cloud of realization seemed to materialize around us all at once. Realization 1, contradicting all fables, turtles are not uniformly slow. Number 2, we were in the presence of an utterly magnificent, deeply alien, and surprisingly powerful creature, a radical other whose decipherable action, the best defense is a good offense, flickered briefly out of and retracted back into the inscrutable realm of its own mysterious life world. 3, this snapping turtle nearly bit my finger off. And finally, 4, we still had to figure out how to get this scary beast off the road. It is common to think of the mouth as the vocal organ, but voice clearly does not exhaust the mouth's capabilities. As Brandon LaBelle has observed, the mouth is simultaneously the orifice for vocal emissions and the toothy interface between self and world. Or better, the monstrous machine on your face that through chewing and ingestion turns world into self. He said, burping. In Lexicon of the Mouth, he has a whole chapter on the burp, so it's apropos. In Lexicon of the Mouth, LaBelle muses upon the organ's many actions, including, notably, the bite. Here's what LaBelle had to say about the bite. We may learn from the bite both the materiality of earthly matter, of affection and care, of what is available for sustaining the body, as well as the inherent force of the mouth to wound and defend, to appropriate and to resist, to reshape the individual and social body through radical acts of ingestion. Biting is a negotiation with power. The snapping turtle's beak is a lipless mouth, hard, efficient, unkissable. It is also the most formidable weapon this miniature mud-born leviathan possesses, capable of cutting a human finger off at the palm with a single bite. It is an action that speaks louder than words. Months later, I can still remember the feel of the puff of air from his jaws snapping shut. It was that close to my finger. And the hollow sound, like a Foley artist clapping 2 coconut shells together to approximate the sound of a horse hoof on cobblestones. This close encounter serves me now as a cautionary tale against future turtle meetings, but also as a cryptic reminder of the monstrous potential of the vocal enterprise broadly conceived. We know that a word spoken in anger can wound its recipient, and that this word can set up a loop in one's consciousness and exert its caustic effect over one's entire life. This is not the perfect example, but I can still hear the one time my genteel Southern mother swore in my presence when I, as a child, carelessly shattered a gallon bottle of Ernest and Julio red wine in a grocery store parking lot. "Damnation," she said. 19th century, searing into my memory. We know, therefore, that vocal effects can stretch far beyond the time span of the utterance. But the atmospheric voice's many entanglements lengthen this timeline exponentially, binding it to the inhuman, epochal temporality of climate change and ecological collapse. My left index finger, spared by dumb luck from the turtle's bite, now helps me hold in mind the multiplex disturbances that vocality underwrites. From the psychic wounds of our current blasphemies and maledictions to the slow environmental wounds inflicted by our distinctly vocal species, voice, in both its human or sonorous and its post-human or atmospheric forms, provides multiple potential vectors for violence. Within the atmospheric register, these vectors are some of the very few things that clearly distinguish humans from other species. Non-human vocal emissions are largely singular and are perfectly synchronous with the carbon cycle. They are carbon neutral. Human industrial vocal emissions are distributional and destabilize that cycle. Industrial emissions, car exhaust, smokestacks, livestock flatulence, that's still ours, landfill gas, we must understand these as part of the great human hyperchorus, the sum total of the gaseous exchanges we initiate. I realize that it's strange to think of a smokestack or a methane leak as vocal, but doing so helps to remind us of our ownership of them. It ties these consequential emissions to our bodies, no matter how far away from us we place them, and it alerts us to the hidden expressive potential they possess. The atmospheric conception of voice leads us ineluctably to the topic of environmental racism. And it is incontestable that some areas in the atmosphere are more dirty and deadly than others, and that this dirt and death are to a large extent the byproducts of colonial histories. According to some estimates, if you were to stand outside in the Indian capital of Delhi in the smoky month of November and just breathe for a full hour, you would be reducing your life expectancy by 1 hour. There are places on the planet where the life-sustaining and life-negating capacities of the atmosphere are in a kind of terrible balance. The fact that the sound and significance of the human voices emanating from these regions have also been historically subject to violent erasure is thus not coincidental, but foreordained. Embodied voices, the voices that we recognize as voices, are instruments for articulating difference through expressions, accents, timbre, pitch, intonation. Atmospheric voices articulate difference through particulate counts and actuarial tables. Returning to the turtle, I want to think about his sensorium. Much has been written about turtle eyesight, which is generally quite acute. But the most salient point for us here is that while snapping turtles have ears, they don't possess a sophisticated sense of hearing. They can sense some low-frequency vibrations through their ears and skin, but their auditory system lacks a tympanic membrane, an eardrum, and so is unable to transduce most sound waves into chemical impulses that the auditory cortex would register as sounds. Instead, turtles use their ears primarily to detect differences in air and water pressure. The turtle was likely unaware, therefore, of the sound of my howl of surprise when he shot out his neck and snapped his jaws. Call and response was not achieved by the two of us. His hiss was not a reaction to my howl, but to my touch. In addition to their sharp eyes, snapping turtles possess a highly developed sense of smell. Small beard-like protrusions called barbels hang from their chins. These sensory organs are connected to their olfactory system and enhance their ability to detect the scent of prey and predators. In other words, the turtle in the road was almost certainly straining to smell me, to learn something about me and my intentions from the me-scented air. At the same time, I, with my rudimentary nose, was confronted by the notable smell the turtle produced. His hiss had released a stream of breath that infused the air between us with the penetrating scent of his dark interior. Moreover, I later learned that the turtle had almost certainly secreted an odoriferous aerosol from 4 musk glands near its hind legs. This is a defense tactic that snapping turtles share with skunks, although in a much less powerful concentration. The combined effect of these excretions was arresting. The air smelled like rotting marsh, body odor, overripe fruit, dead fish, brine. I circled around and looked him in the eye again, from a safe distance this time, trying not to think of what his beak could have done to my face when it was up close. I inhaled deeply, pulling microscopic particles of turtle into my lungs. He breathed me in as well. We faced each other, connected not by the sound of our voices, but by the charged air our voices had released. For the unhearing turtle, and now through a stretch of the imagination for me, voice was not vibration, but vibrant matter, floating on the breeze. Voice, for the two of us, was a manifestation of what I suggest we call sharing without intimacy. As a heuristic, sharing without intimacy stands in contrast with the widespread understanding of vocal exchanges as involving acts of will in the form of call and response, mutual intelligibility in the form of shared codes and auditory regimes, and a hermeneutic telos or goal, a meeting of the minds or expanding of horizons. Sharing without intimacy points to the inscrutable, invisible, inaudible relationality that sutures all atmospheric creatures together and renders them vulnerable to one another. There are, of course, zones of intimate atmospheric sharing. The kind of face-to-face breathing that lovers and sumo wrestlers and katayak performers and cramped carolers engage in is a dynamic zone of pheromones, co-presence, affect, sound, and feeling. I can feel the warmth of your breath on my face. I drink in your breath along with your words. As the philosopher Emmanuel Levinas might have put it, I confront the totality of your beguiling selfhood in the activity of close, face-to-face mutual inspiration. We know this. This literal hot center of vocality where everything is shared, from sound to feeling to microbes to lunch menus, doesn't have to be human on human. Consider Donna Haraway's description of her intimate vocal encounters with her dog, Cayenne. On one occasion of face-to-face cooing and sniffing, Cayenne gave Haraway a sloppy kiss on her open mouth, the dog's tongue reaching the back of its owner's throat. Who knows, Haraway asks, where my chemical receptors carried her messages, or what she took from my cellular system for distinguishing self from other and binding outside to inside. In intimate situations, through olfaction and aspiration and sound and sentiment, I turn myself inside out before you, and you before me. But take a step back in space or in register, and the sharing is no less profound. It just loses its intimacy and its pansensorial flair. Tyler Volk, an atmospheric chemist colleague of mine at NYU, once explained the atmospheric commons to me like this. Okay, this is the participant part. Everybody take a breath, take a big breath, and on the internet too. Now let it out. Roughly 1 year from now, several carbon atoms from that very breath that you just exhaled will be present in every blade of grass on the planet. That's not a metaphor or anything. That's actually the way that the atmosphere refreshes itself, cycles on a roughly annual scale, evenly distributes things as light as carbon atoms. So that breath, right, will wait a year, and literally every blade of grass will have you in it, which means that, of course, the breath you just took was filled with other people's and sheep and car and turtle exhalations. There is no such thing as fresh air. I don't know about you, but this realization gave me, when I first had it, a feeling of claustrophobia, a feeling like there's no escape from the small, airless room I find myself trapped in, that room being Earth. Rather than dismiss this feeling, I think thriving in the Anthropocene demands that we wrestle with it, that we strive for a kind of, for lack of a better word, claustrophilia, like a kind of comfort with being that connected atmospherically with one another and our radical others. In any event, these mental exertions are part of what my colleague Una Daughtry calls developing an atmospheric consciousness, which is a pithy way of describing my project here, and a pithy way of describing life moving forward. Breath is an existential priority for a host of creatures, including mammals of all shapes and sizes. Breathing is the continuous ebb and flow that sutures us chiasmically to the world and to one another. Within this atmospheric context, holding one's breath can be understood as an act of relative independence, defiance even. Hold your breath right now, okay? Big breath in, and hold it till I give you a signal. For the next few moments, until your next breath, you will have disentangled yourself, partially, imperfectly, temporarily, but palpably, from the turbulent, life-giving chaos that is atmosphere. Okay, let it go. If I hold my breath for more than 10 or 15 seconds, I usually experience a gradual increase in the physical effort that this willful act requires, followed by a creeping sense of dread, an accelerated heartbeat, widening of eyes, a burning of discomfort in my chest, and eventual capitulation in the form of an outward burst of pent-up air, followed by a greedy inhalation or two. Try as I might, I cannot flout my atmospheric obligations for long. At the same time, I can't help but observe that with the proliferation of surgical and other kinds of breathing masks around the world, we are witnessing the birth of a new fantasy of disentanglement with our sullied Anthropocenic atmosphere, air that is understood to be charged with carcinogenic particles, dangerous toxins, and contagious microorganisms. The current transnational crisis surrounding the coronavirus is only the most recent intensifier of this trend, which appears to have begun in China around 20 years ago with the SARS outbreak and continues apace in my neighborhood in New York City. I imagine in St. John's you don't see a lot of people wearing surgical masks. But over the past few years, no day goes by without me in Manhattan seeing a dozen or so people wearing masks as they walk down the street. When I visited China in 2016, in Beijing, it was, you could, I don't know, 15% of people that summer. Regardless of the efficacy of the surgical mask as a microbial filter, its performative value is clear. The surgical mask is a public performance of what sociologist Arpad Shakolchai calls permanent liminality. The somber fact is that we are all liminal creatures now, all trapped betwixt and between pure air and solid matter, breathing sky that is clouded with land, nature that is infused with culture, air that sustains and denies life at the same time, invisible matter charged with invisible doctrines, within an atmosphere that connects us all into a global ecology of sharing without intimacy. We are permanently, paradoxically trapped between these substances, and the mask is the mystical marker of our vulnerability to one another. Our existential requirement of a constant supply of non-toxic air is what makes creatures who have the ability to prolong a state of untroubled breathlessness so very remarkable. After hyperventilating oxygen for a period of time, human free divers have spent upwards of 22 minutes underwater without breathing. This is more than the average beaver, who dives for 15 minutes at a time. Several species of whale, we know, are able to hunt underwater for more than an hour or more, a feat made all the more incredible by the abyssal depths these mammals plumb and the crushing pressures they endure. Now again, while I was unaware of this at the time of our encounter, I was soon to learn that the snapping turtle has the greatest known capacity to hold its breath among vertebrates. Each winter in my region, snapping turtles retreat beneath the water's surface to hibernate for several months. How, you ask, can they do this if they have no gills? Separated from the atmosphere by several feet of pond water and an intermittent layer of ice, they oxygenate their blood every so often by slowly agitating the water with their back feet. This seemingly inconsequential action creates a small current of water that flows along a capillary-rich area near the turtle's anus. With this occasional flap of the foot, a minuscule but vital amount of oxygen passes through a thin cloacal membrane in the anus and into the turtle's blood. It's called cloacal breathing. I ask you, is the Queen of the Night aria a more virtuosic performance of atmospheric voice than this? As we continued to stare at him there on the hot asphalt, my sons wondered aloud if perhaps the turtle had stopped in the middle of the road because he got overheated. I dispatched Joey to the cabin for water. He returned a few minutes later with a large metal salad bowl, sloshing water over the sides as he walked. Carefully, so as not to shock the creature, I poured a small stream onto his leg. In his first move since the hiss, the turtle slowly turned, inching over so that the stream hit more of his body. Taking this cue, I slowly swung the bowl toward his mouth, which was upturned now, a heart-shaped, smooth pink orifice that had swung wide open like a jewel box on hinges. I poured the rest of the water into the mouth, which remained open and appeared to be swallowing. All of the turtle's motions now were languid and smooth, a slow turn of the head, an adjusting of position in the puddle that we had created on the pavement. It appeared to be luxuriating in the stream I poured. I bent closer to drip the last drops of water into the turtle's mouth. Without warning, the head shot forward like a fist again and struck at the bowl in my hands. The beak hit metal and clanged like a bell, powerful enough to produce an echo once again from across the pond. I felt the impact all the way up to my shoulders. Once again, the boys and I involuntarily shouted, "Ho!" Once again, my pulse raced. Once again, the turtle withdrew into stillness, transforming itself back into the inanimate mound in the road. Time prevents me from giving a detailed account of the conclusion of our meeting with the turtle. Suffice it to say, we'd be here all night. Suffice it to say, a tarp was procured, a snow shovel deployed, and slowly, gently, effortfully, we dragged the beast onto the grassy side of the road. We returned these tools back to the cabin, and then 2 or 3 minutes later, doubled back to get one last look at him. You may or may not be surprised to hear that in that time, he had completely vanished, was nowhere to be found in the hayfield, and has not yet returned. What did this brief encounter with a turtle last summer teach me? I certainly learned a lot of things about the interspecies gaze and atmospheric voice. The whole tension between voice, intimacy, surveillance, distance, and sharing was unknown to me before this encounter. I find myself wanting to say not just that I learned these things, but that the turtle taught them to me. He wasn't just a random, abstract mirror for my thoughts. He wasn't an environmental echo or sounding board. I could only have had these thoughts after my encounter with him. But if the turtle did indeed teach me, he taught me truths that he did not know, could not know, still doesn't know, will never know. He is incapable of learning that which he taught me. Now this, it strikes me, is a fairly profound lesson in itself. Teaching can take place in the absence of both pre-existing knowledge and mutual enlightenment. Given that I too am a teacher, this realization is really unsettling. What do you know now, having listened to me, that I don't and can't know? I recall my John Durham Peters quote from the beginning: to meet abysses of communication at every hand is part of what it means to be modern. Now, Wittgenstein might have been right about the lion, but we're all entangled in, or rather part of, an unstable environment that is moving toward collapse. And thriving in this situation means getting comfortable with paradoxes. Paradoxophilia is my new motto. Human perception is based, the phenomenologists tell us that human perception is based on foreground-background relations, right? In order for me to look at you, these people have to be in the background, right? In order for me to look at them, you have to be in the background. That's just kind of hard baked into human consciousness and our sensoria, right? But environmental entanglement means that there is only foreground, no background. Our environmental situation is demanding of us that we do something that is actually physically impossible, to hold everything in the foreground. Consider everything as equally entangled with itself. In order to survive, we have to do that, but while we are human, we cannot do that. That's a paradox. Survival hinges on our dismantling our human-centered dualistic metaphysics, but modern life cannot exist without it. That's another paradox. We will never understand the life world of turtles, but we really need to understand the life world of turtles. That's a third paradox. And so, knowing that I can't ever really access turtle consciousness, I nonetheless imagine it. The move from Martin consciousness to turtle consciousness would probably begin with a kind of forgetting, a bracketing off of the aspects of thought that are unique to humans. The turtle isn't born into language, at least not to language as we know it. With words or without them, I imagine the turtle isn't predisposed to the kind of prolonged reverie that produced this talk either. I sense that the turtle is committed to getting on with it. By it, I mean life, pragmatically. It's easy to presume that turtle being is a kind of stripped-down version of human consciousness. That's what the philosopher Martin Heidegger said, that animals are, quote-unquote, poor in world compared to humans. But in addition to this stripping down, wouldn't turtle consciousness also mean a building up of a kind of amphibian being of which I can only fantasize or speculate? Do the intensive smells that the barbels sense have a kind of wordless poetry to them? Well, if a poem is a structured polysemic piece of language, then probably no. But if a poem is a microcosmic distillation and intensification of world, then possibly yes. How deeply felt, how richly experienced are the earthly urges, the unceasing labors, the strange socialities of the turtle I encountered. Snapping turtles have sex once every 10 years. What is the structure of feeling that accompanies his retreat into the water, shrinking away from the atmosphere with its heat and soot and pickup trucks and bipedal mammals and the effortful movements these all require? What is the emotional flavor of the descent into the slowness, dare I say calmness, of a stretch of aquatic hibernation and cloacal breathing? What expressive energies are accrued and spent within a vocal economy where speech is a monosyllabic hiss and everything else is breathing and attunement? What insights are possible in turtle world? What in-smells? And what, in the end, was I to the turtle in the road? What, in the end, was I to the turtle in the road? Sudden presence? Threat? Potential predator? Disruptor? Toucher? Mover? Lifesaver? Pest? Stranger? Absence? But also smell giver, breath sharer, affect transmitter, chemical catalyst, soft wind, turbulence creator, gas transducer? I don't and will never know. In the end, my turtle story leads me to conclude that voice's relationship to environment is one of existential entanglement, material sharing, and co-vulnerability. This is a far cry from current discourse on voice, which continues to present it in terms of sound, language, communication, emotional expression, human agency, etc. The turtle convinces me that voice is always bigger than sound, and that human vocality has tentacles that bind us to multiple spaces and inhuman temporalities. While I can't accurately project myself into turtle world, or even audience world, or even Martin world, I will continue to attempt to wrap my mind around the fact that we and all respiring creatures are connected to one another through the tidal rhythms of the Anthropocenic atmosphere we helped create, a dynamic, agentive atmosphere which penetrates and withdraws from our bodies in a manner that generates voices, faint or loud, intentional or unconscious, whose implications radically exceed the sonic. Thank you very much.
There's just a whole lot of things going through my head right now, but one is the incredible resonance of what you're saying with some indigenous belief systems. And I wondered if that was something, I mean, even down to the turtle, which of course is a metaphor for the earth in Haudenosaunee tradition, and the ground on the back of the turtle is what we live on. But that's just the metaphor. I'm thinking of things such as working with musicians who position themselves so that their voices sound differently in relation to air currents, something that I don't know singers in other traditions doing. The resonances with indigenous studies, there's so many, and have you thought about those?
The short answer is yes, but not enough. I consciously had you in my mind as I wrote this piece. I knew I was going to present it here, and I hoped that you would be in the audience, and I hoped that this would be the beginning of a conversation that we could have about indigenous epistemologies. Because, you know, I've in this project I've done a lot of writing. If I have a kind of an activist platform, if I'm writing against anything, I'm writing against anthropocentrism, human nature dualism, and human exceptionalism. Those kind of three intertwined topics, and I have found the greatest challenge of kind of intellectual challenge for me is in acknowledging that there are and always have been and continue to be and will be traditions that do not that kind of explicitly or implicitly position themselves against that kind of dualistic relationship with world, where the tradition itself problematizes it. So any generalization that I make, if I were to make a generalization about music, let's say, as I have in another piece, I'm constantly issuing these kind of caveats, right? At the same time, I personally am deeply curious, and I've in another piece that I wrote, I cite you. I need to show it to you because you're kind of in it, and you know, I want to maintain my curiosity without kind of without attempting to perform some kind of actual knowledge of these traditions that I don't and will never have. Do you know what I mean? So I'm trying to figure out a way to acknowledge the existence of them without me kind of trying to sort of mansplain them. And I'm finding that a real challenge. I think if I were to live my life over, my professional life over again, I might do it very differently, because this is kind of the overriding concern for me right now. And I find myself aware of, but distanced from kind of situated, grounded answers or rejoinders to the kind of thought world that I'm like a turtle beating my head against.
Can I make a really quick response to that? I want to show you a piece by a Métis guy from Alberta who writes about the rhythms of air and the rhythms of our associations, such that at times there can be no real resonance between things, and at times there's a lot of resonance, and those are very magical moments. And you may have found that magical moment where you don't need to acknowledge something else, but there is a resonance there that I think is very powerful.
Yeah. Well, one other thought that I have kind of on that score, on that question, is that, you know, we all know that there's a multiplicity of metaphysics that have emerged in human practice, and that there is no global we, right? At the same time, I think a credible case can be made that the particular metaphysics that allowed us to think that we were, on the one hand, that humans were exceptional creatures and that the environment was a resource for them, on the one hand, so that's manifestation of hubris, but that at the same time, paradoxically, we are so small and insignificant that anything that we could do, and nature is so big that anything that we could do would never impact it. That those kind of two affects are really kind of hardwired into the human nature dualism as it is practiced, and unfortunately, regardless of the vast multiplicity of traditions out there that have, you know, better answers to the question of the relationship between the human and the environment, that particular metaphysics brought us to this. It's not humanity; it's that metaphysics and its followers its zombies who brought us to the brink of global environmental collapse. Right. So on the one hand, I think it's important to for me to recognize that that there is this kind of vast spectrums of approaches to the question, of the relationship between the human and the environment, while also saying that this one question kind of historically dominated, and that we can treat it there, and without also I don't want to essentialize the West and say that it's only the West and that it's this Western kind of thing, and that everyone else is kind of has clean hands. So as I talk, my incoherence here is just for me like a reflection of the complexity of this problem. But I have in my recent writing made lots of notes to myself saying, Bev Diamond needs to help me with this problem. So, and I'm being totally honest. Yeah.
Thank you. So I'm thinking of this Daoism in Chinese culture. I don't know if you know much about it, but it's all about the harmony between environment and human beings, and so which influence Chinese people's daily life, and we worship this harmony a lot. And of course, there are conflicts between the whole environment and our human body and our thinkings, as you said in your talk, paradox. And so I'm just wondering, how do you see this, or relationships maybe between this harmony and the conflicts or paradox in our atmospheric living being every day? I don't know if you have any thought about that.
Yeah. So you said Taoism?
Taoism, yeah.
I think this is a very similar situation to the indigenous traditions that Bev was pointing to, right? That there are these traditions that have cast that relationship in terms, there are panpsychic traditions that have assigned consciousness to things that many of us, I think, would consider not just non-human but non-life. And there are perspectivalist traditions, multinatural traditions that make this move. I guess I think that for me the interesting thing was how I could kind of get to a position of to an appreciation of the extent of our environmental entanglements without making recourse to those traditions. I think in the end that only strengthens my appreciation for those traditions. But again, I don't want to like read one book on Taoism and then say, now the Taoists say, So I kind of have made a conscious choice to kind of see where this kind of my direct experience with, in upstate New York, how I could just kind of as meticulously as I could follow the implications, and as it turns out, the path that I take, doesn't kind of necessarily cross lines, but gets to apparently a very similar destination to the path that many others before me have taken. So that makes me all the more interested in Taoism, but all the more committed to not pretending like I know enough to write about Taoism. Does that make sense? Which means I want to talk to you more. Yeah.
Hi, I just wondered if you could explain a little bit more about one of the paradoxes you mentioned, particularly the one where you said that our survival depends on everything being in the foreground.
Yeah.
Because it's a complete contradiction to how I understand our survival works.
Okay. This is a little bit of, you could say creative or you could say messy thinking on my part, but the idea for me is that if, and Harry can tell us as our resident phenomenologist, if indeed it is true that human consciousness works like nobody taught. Is that me? Is that my? It's okay. Nobody taught me to place you in the like how to place you in the foreground and Spencer in the background. Just as nobody taught a fox how to put the rabbit in the foreground and the field in the background. But if the fox couldn't do that, it couldn't catch the rabbit, and there would be no more foxes, right? So foreground-background relations, that's how I hear you saying that foreground-background relations are key to survival. So I think within, right, everything is foreground. So within a kind of a human or a sentient or a biological register, time scale, spatial scale, foreground, being able to put something in the foreground and understand something else's background is absolutely necessary for our short-term survival. But thank you so much. On a planetary time scale, to be able to concentrate on one another, we kind of necessarily have to place that which is not one another into a conceptual background. I mean, now these traditions that we've been talking about seem to have figured out a way around that, or a more kind of holistic way to embrace the non-human. But all of the things that the science of, like the contemporary earth science and atmospheric chemistry is telling us, is that these things you have to take account for these microscopic objects. They cannot be forgotten. They cannot be bracketed out. It's those microscopic objects that are having collectively having a destabilizing effect on atmosphere and are connected with global warming. You also can't put into the background these things that are kind of massively more than human. Timothy Morton, a philosopher who I love reading, who infuriates a lot of people, calls these things hyperobjects, right? Objects that are so massively distributed in time and space that we can only perceive local manifestations of them. We can't perceive the whole thing. So the planet Earth is a hyperobject. The entire stockpile of styrofoam on the planet, like every piece of styrofoam, is a single hyperobject. This is an object, and so I can put it in the foreground, and I can put other things in the background, and I can grasp it, and I can think it. Microphone. But a hyperobject is too large to be able to do that. All I can do is catch one little effect of it or one little piece of it and hold on to it. But it's, as Morton and some of his followers say, it's the hyperobjects that are having the destabling effect on the Earth's biosphere, and they're having that effect whether we think them or not. So that for me is the paradox, is that there's this thing that is too big for me to think, too massively distributed for me to have any direct experience of, and yet that is the thing. It's either too big or it's too small, but that is the thing that I somehow have unwittingly helped create. And that's the thing that we need to kind of hold in the foreground, hold in our thought, in order to have any kind of effect on, in order to do any work on. And maybe the work that we do on it is simply the work of mourning. It's not a question of activism or mourning, but maybe mourning is the activism that we need to do. Maybe we just need to mourn that which we've already lost, and that the future that we have foreclosed for ourselves, and have that be, what hyper-objective thinking is about. But for me, there's something that does not and cannot line up between objects and hyper-objects, or between our consciousness and the situation that we're now in, where where nothing can be forgotten, nothing can be allowed to recede. Everything is entangled equally with everything else, and so the whole it's just I guess a very fancy way of speaking about the fact that we cannot solve this problem, the insolubility of the problem. Which just turns me back to music, to be quite frank. My undergraduate teaching is now all, I'm not teaching this stuff to my NYU undergraduates, I'm teaching jazz. And I'm teaching them jazz as, Harry and I mentioned, we spoke about this at dinner, the blues scholar Albert Murray called the blues equipment for living. And I've never been more moved by three words. He meant that in a particular socio-historical kind of sense, but in the world that we have, in the world that we have helped create, in the world into which we've been thrown, I think we can do a lot worse than, hold on to and cherish and cultivate small tools that are not going to, jazz is not going to save the world, but it's going to be equipment for living that helps me and hopefully my students and loved ones thrive in the world that we've been given. So there's a kind of a scaling down that I've been doing in my thinking that has returned me to music, to my surprise, as someone who kind of started out in music and headed off into other stranger territory.
I want to thank all you for coming and wish all of you a good evening. Thank you very much.
Thank you, people.